10 seconds left. Tajay pivots. The freshman Jackson. Here's Stevens. Step back. He did it again. With 3.4, Colorado State leads by 1.
You have got to be kidding me. This guy is in the zone.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to Basketball in the Mountains. This is episode 8, and today we have got a massive Mountain West tournament and Big 12 tournament preview. I will talk about the Big 12 tournament and Colorado's chances, very slim chances to do much of anything in Kansas City in part 2 with Troy Finnegan. But we're going to talk about the Rams and Colorado State and the Mountain West in part 1. And to do so, we've got Justin Michael from DNVR. Justin was one of my first guests on episode 1 back a couple weeks ago. So, and Justin and I got a little home and home agreement here. I was on his podcast this week, so make sure to go check that out. His DNVR Rams podcast. We also talked about the Mountain West tournament, so you'll get a little bit of both. But Justin, thanks for coming on and talking Mountain West hoops here.
Anytime, man. Always fun. Talk hoops with a fellow supporter, fellow sneakerhead as well. It's a sick collection you got in the background.
I appreciate that. Yeah, well, I wanted to start off today because I didn't get a chance to really do an instant reaction. I was hoping to maybe do an emergency podcast on Friday night, but I was just too busy with DU hockey, and I had to go cover CU the next day against TCU. But with Nick Clifford's all-time performance at Boise State, coupled with Nikola Jokic's 30-20-20 first person to ever do that. Both of those happening simultaneously on Friday night was a pretty special evening for basketball for fans in the state of Colorado. Justin, obviously, Colorado State kind of needed that win over Boise State on the road. Their only quad 1 win as of right now. To kind of keep that at-large NCAA tournament bid hopes alive. Because, I mean, despite how well the Rams have played all throughout the Mountain West Conference play, they really hadn't shown up at all in the bubble because of the poor, non-conference resume with some disappointing losses, whether it was at home to UC Riverside or getting blown out at CU. Those are just 2 games that I think Nico Medved's team would really want back. But I mean, this is a very different team now. They went 16-4 in Mountain West play after the win at Boise, a program record for conference wins. I just where does that one at Boise the other night rank for you? Not just in terms of Nick Clifford's individual performance, but just how big the win was for the Rams as a whole.
It was big. I mean, Boise is a tough place to win. That 2022 team went in there on Super Bowl Sunday with Roddy and Stevens, and they beat Boise as well. So Degenhart, despite being one of the all-time great Mountain West players, both starts and ends his career with home losses to CSU, which is kind of tough. No, I'm not trying to troll too much, but yeah, I thought this was epic, man. It's up there with a couple of the times CSU's gone into Viejas and pulled out big wins. Obviously, anytime you can win in the pit, it's huge. But that's one of the toughest things about the Mountain West that I don't think people that don't follow the league quite understand is how hard it is to go out and win on the road. And this CSU team winning 7 road games and sweeping 7 opponents this year is really, really significant, especially considering where they were at in November and their ascension and their ability to ride it out and really kind of develop into a well-functioning and highly tough competitive team has been a lot of fun to watch. But watching Nick drop 36 points, and not only that, but to do it on 13 of 18 from the field. And at one point, he had to have made like 11, 12 in a row because he missed his first 2 pretty badly. Like the announcers are talking about it. He leaves one short, then he shoots a 3-way long. And then from there, just in complete control and puts on what I would say is the most impressive performance I've seen in the Medved era from any individual. Isaiah had some great moments, some big time games against UNLV. Roddy, dropped 30 plus 3 different times his last year. But to see what Nick did on the road against a sold out crowd, like on Degenhart's senior night, that was some superstar stuff.
Absolutely. And I think we talked about this on your podcast as well, but it's kind of everything about Neek's development was on full display in that game. I've talked about this a bunch on this podcast. Like, he was not this player at CU. I remember covering his first couple of years there. His best year was his sophomore year at CU, and then he just really lost a ton of confidence in that junior season, especially offensively. Like, he was always a really good defensive player and was CU's best perimeter defender during his time there, but just was not nearly the same player offensively. Wasn't asked to do nearly this much, but I always felt like he had a really high or had NBA potential, despite not really getting to show and develop as much as maybe he wanted to in Boulder. But I mean, whether it was the shot making from three on the baseline, like turnaround fadeaway jumpers, getting to the rim, getting to the free throw line and making his free throws. I mean, all of that has just been a remarkable development for a guy who's also got elite athleticism, got good length, is a really good defender. And on nights like that, you need your stars to be your stars if you're going to win these tough Mountain West road games. Like you said, I mean, I think all the top 5 teams in the Mountain West this year have really, really good home environments, whether it's the Pit, Viejas, Extra Mile, Moby. Utah State's environment is awesome too. Like, even Wyoming, when they're good, that environment is rocking. Same for UNLV and Nevada a little bit too. The Mountain West is just loaded with really, really good environments. And to win some of these games on the road, which CSU set a record for, I think they set a record for program road wins in conference play too. They've just really had a knack for getting these wins and getting to do the snack time afterward. That's one of the cooler things I've seen since moving here and covering these teams. They've just got a really good recipe for success on the road, whether it's getting a good performance from a guy like Neek and then the role players showing up too, whether it's Cayenne and Jalen Lake hitting threes, the big guys, Crocker Johnson and Rashawn Bemba going to work down low, and then the guys off the bench too. I just think everything that was on full display, everything that makes the Rams dangerous this week in Las Vegas was on full display in that game in Boise. Do you agree?
Yeah, without a doubt. And really, I think you could look at, I mean, obviously the last couple of weeks, they've won 7 straight, but the last 7 days of the regular season in particular, I mean, they beat Utah State, a team that's pretty widely projected in the field by 27, like 6 days before this win.
Yeah.
So they're really playing good team basketball right now. They're valuing their offensive possessions. One of the stats that I pointed out consistently over the course of the year, I believe they're now 12-1 when they have 10 or less turnovers. So it's pretty obvious. Like, if you're valuing your possession, same deal. Like, when they rack up 20 assists, they almost never lose, but that means you're making a lot of shots. So that would make sense. But they'll hound you defensively. Offensively, they've got a couple of guys that can light you up, and Neek and Cayenne has really ascended as a scorer as well. But everybody just kind of fills their role, and that's another thing we talked about on my show. But I just feel like they're kind of an old school college basketball team, even though they were constructed through the transfer portal. Like, they've just kind of got a lot of guys who aren't necessarily superstars. I mean, Neek is really good. I think Cayenne has the potential to be a conference player of the year down the line. But it's, glue guys like Ethan Morton, who is just a really, elite defender. I mean, he's tremendous. He's a great rebounder. Doesn't do a ton offensively, but he has grown a lot in that area as well. You've got guys that can come off the bench that have played, in almost 200 college basketball games with Keyshawn Williams and Bowen Bourne. I think they just kind of wear teams down. They've got great depth, and while maybe they're not quite as dangerous at the top end in terms of maybe their starting lineup doesn't overwhelm you to the extent of New Mexico or even like Utah State with both Falslove and Martinez in that starting lineup, or Degenhart and Cardenas.
Yeah.
But I think they're playing as well as anybody. And I think what makes this team maybe a little bit more intriguing than some of the other ones has just been the consistency. Like, you've seen the Rams win the games they're supposed to, and now they're also kind of punching up and pulling off some impressive wins as well.
All right, as a way to segue into the Mountain West tournament preview, I wanted to go over, Troy and I do this in part 2 for our Big 12 preview as well, but I want to do some postseason awards, not the full list of awards that you'll see from the conference. And both Justin and I's votes here are unofficial, but we'll do player of the year, coach of the year, and then your top 5-man first team all conference unit. You can be regardless of position, just the top 5 guys you think in the conference. So give me your player of the year pick, man. Who do you got?
I went with Neat Clifford, and I think Dent is probably going to win. They swept
I agree.
CSU. He's the first guard to average 20 and 6 in the league, although Neek averages 20 and 5. So I'm like, all right, like we're splitting hairs here. And Neek's more efficient, a way better 3-point shooter, averages way more rebounds. Like I can go back and forth all day. I just think Neek elevated his team's ceiling drastically more than anybody in the league. And New Mexico was supposed to be really good. And I know that's not necessarily fair to quote unquote punish Dent because he's got a great team. But I'm not really trying to do that. It's not really me trying to poke holes in his case. It's just pointing out how much Neek elevates this team. Like they were picked 7th for a reason. And to win 16 games in league play, it's largely due to him. So to me, the argument kind of comes down to where would this team be without CSU versus, where would UNM be without Donovan Dent? I still think they'd be a pretty decent team, like True Washington, Nelly Jr. Joseph. I still think they're a top 5 team in the league. Maybe they don't win as convincingly as they have because Dent's incredible. But CSU without Clifford, I'm not sure they win 16 games all year, let alone 16 league games.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. Neek is my pick as well for player of the year for all the reasons you just said. Like I've actually been a really big fan of Donovan Dent for a couple of years now. I thought he was their best player last season. I thought in the games where either Jamal Mashburn or Jalen House missed the game or got into foul trouble, whatever,
They were better.
and Dent was allowed to do more, they were better. I've been a really big fan of Dent for a while. But I have Neek too. Like I just have been. I think your point about him elevating the ceiling is the most appropriate one. It's because he does everything. Like it's not just the scoring, which he's at 19.6 points per game in conference play. It's not just the rebounding, the 9 rebounds per game, and he's had games plenty with double digits. I think the biggest thing is the assists too. Like he's 4th in the conference in assists at 5 a game, and he's top 10 in assist to turnover ratio too. Like, and there's some really, really good guards in this league, whether it is Cardenas or Dedan Thomas or Drake Allen at Utah State, Dent included. But this was never Neek's archetype. Like this is something that he's only really become this season. Even last year, he was playing off of Isaiah Stevens and thriving in a different role. But this year, he's just doing so much for them. And even we mentioned Kyan Evans having an ascension here. It's still because he's playing. A lot of it is because he's able to play off Neek so well. And then you throw in the defense too with Neek, which he's always been a really, really elite defender. And when CSU has Neek, Jalen Lake, and Ethan Morton all out there, like that's just a ton of length. That the rest of the Mountain West doesn't really have. And I think it's a huge reason why CSU has had such a good season defensively too. But I mean, Neek's rebounding, like I mentioned, is a huge asset. Like all the other guys have to do is just really box out, and Neek will use his athleticism to jump up and beat everybody else with the ball. I really do think he impacted winning more than anybody else in the conference this year. And that's why I think he would be my player of the year as well. So we'll move on to coach of the year. Who do you got there?
I really struggled with this one because I felt like in principle, I can't give New Mexico neither of them. They swept CSU.
Yeah.
They were outright champions. I think Medved did a better coaching job than Patino. If you put a knife to my back and said, who did a more impressive coaching job? I think Medved did more with less. I think you can see the growth of this team. I think in principle, Patino essentially has to get it just because they got to win one of these. They won 17 games and they swept CSU. So while I wholeheartedly believe Medved is the better coach of the two, I reluctantly give it to Patino out of principle.
I feel the exact same way. Like I do think, like I said, gun to my head, I think Nico has had a more impressive coaching job, but I don't want to discredit what Patino has done in Albuquerque as well, because I mean, despite me not always being the biggest fan of these two guys, like Jalen House and Jamal Mashburn were really beloved players there and were really productive for a long time. They also lost the best freshman in the conference in JT Toppin, who went on to become the Big 12 Player of the Year.
All-American.
Yeah, is going to be an All-American, and who Troy and I, spoiler alert, later in the podcast, both picked as our Big 12 Player of the Year. Like, losing a guy like that and the Mashburn in-house, I think, is a really big deal. Like I said, I've been a fan of Dent for a while, so I knew they had a star coming into the year, but what Nelly Jr. Joseph has become for that team has really been really impressive. I like guys like True Washington, Mustafa Amzil. Like, I do think they have a really good 5-man group as well. And we'll talk next or a little bit about the Mountain West tournament and getting into our predictions for that too. But it's kind of the same thing. Like, I just think New Mexico has to get one of these, and I felt more strongly about Neek winning Player of the Year than I did about Nico winning Coach of the Year. So that would be my reasoning for that as well. So then we'll wrap up our awards here with your 5-man first team All Mountain West team.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first team was pretty simple. Like, the second and third teams, I had a harder time. But Neek and Dent are obvious. Like,
Yes.
I don't even think you can argue against them. I think Degenhart is still, one of the top 5 players in the conference. Statistically speaking, scoring, all that backs that up. I also went with Ian Martinez of Utah State. I kind of struggled with that. I went a little back and forth. If you would have asked me a month ago, I probably would have said Falslev because of the two-way impact. I love guys that play defense.
Yeah.
But I just think Falslev, he kind of fizzled out, and Utah State has kind of lost some steam here. And I think Falslev not scoring as much has been kind of part of that. So I went with Martinez, who is the top 5 scorer, deserves to be in the list. And then I went Nelly Jr. Joseph because, I mean, best rebounder in the league. He's also I think he's averaging like 14 points a game. So tough to argue that New Mexico shouldn't have 2 guys.
I have the exact same group, except I did pick Falslev over Martinez. So
I think if you were to ask most coaches which guy would you rather have, a lot of basketball fans would say Martinez because he's the flashier scorer.
Mm-hmm.
Falslev's a dog, though, and that dude's probably going to get paid in the portal. So anticipate it.
Yeah, he is awesome. And I think the reason I picked him over Martinez is the same reason I picked Neek over Dent for Player of the Year. Like, I just think Falslev impacts winning in a bigger way. He is a really, really dogged defender, like you said. He is a good scorer. When his 3-point shooting when he's not like hitting everything like he did against the game against CSU in Logan last month, his scoring can dip a little bit, but I love his ability to attack a closeout, get downhill, get to the rim. He's, a great transition player. He's a good rebounder too. And I think his passing has really developed throughout this season. Like, I think you hit the nail on the head with them. Like, I think Utah State fizzling out a little bit at the end of conference play is because Falslev has dipped a little bit. I still think they're going to be a really dangerous team this week in Las Vegas, but I think that just kind of makes more of the case for Falslev because I think he is just a little bit more important to what they've done this season. And when they're at their best, I think it's when Falslev is at his best individually. So I went with Clifford, Dent, Junior Joseph, Degenhart, and then Falslev as my top 5 there. So anybody else, other than Martinez, as like a close shout out you want to give that you maybe considered for first team?
I mean, you could make an argument for like a Cardenas who leads the league in assists. He scores more, but I think Boise finished. I think the team success factors into this for me a little bit as well. Yeah. So, I mean, there's really nobody I think that would have. There's some good scorers, obviously, like, but like, let me ask you this real quick, and I'm not trying to hijack your podcast, but one of the things I struggle with when I do these types of awards and accolades is I want to value numbers, but bad teams have to have somebody put up shots too. So like I really struggle with like the Obi Agbims. I put him second team all conference, but I was like, honestly, I think there are probably 15 players I'd take over him.
Yeah, probably. I think there is an aspect of wanting to reward the individual seasons as well. It kind of depends on the player. Like for me, it's a case by case thing. Like I would have Obi Abim second team All Mountain West because I think he was their
He's a
entire
top 5
offense.
scorer, so yeah.
Like he's their entire offense at Wyoming. Like they didn't have as that great of a season, and first year coach, all that kind of stuff, lost a bunch of guys. That's kind of expected, but if he wasn't hitting threes, man, it was rough for YO. So I would have had him second team all conference. And then there's some other guys too, like Josh Udije at San Jose State. Like I did not expect much of anything from the Spartans this year. They beat New Mexico at home. Like what do you want to say about the end of that game? Like they were able to get that win over the
I had
over
him
the league
second team
champs.
too. I mean, San Jose State was
Yeah.
frisky. Like they punched
Yeah.
up and they gave Boise a couple of games. They should have beat San
Yep.
Diego State twice. They ended up blowing both of
Yeah.
them, unfortunately. But like, there's a different world here where San Jose State pulls a couple of those, and not only do they impact who ended up finishing top 5, but like maybe they're the 6th seed.
Yeah, for sure. And like a guy like Nick Davidson, who I think is different guy in person. Like when you watch him in person, like he is a real presence down
He's
there.
good. Yeah.
He's another guy I would have had second team, all Mountain West. But like I think you do need to get like another CSU person in the top
I had
10.
Cayenne second team because I think his
I
play
would
in
have
conference
too.
play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I definitely would have had him too. Like because with these kinds of awards, like you don't factor in non-conference play. You're only supposed to factor in the 20 conference games. And I think in these 20 Mountain West games, Kyan Evans has been a top 10 player in the conference. Like I don't think that's a stretch. So I would have had, him, Cardenas in there as well, and then the other 3 guys that I mentioned, Abim, Udije, and Nick Davidson probably
That
would
was
have been
my
my
second
second team.
team. Yeah.
Yeah, that probably would have been my second team, and then third team gets a little bit tougher, and we
It's a
won't
little
delve into
tougher.
that.
Yeah.
But yeah, but I do think the top 5 in this league is pretty unassailable. I guess I would have had to put Martinez on my second team, so maybe I would have bumped somebody like Abem or Udije from that. But I do think that the top 5 in this league, or top 6-ish guys, is pretty unassailable. Like there is some really, really high end talent in this conference, despite maybe or definitely the league is not going to get 6 bids like last season, and it might not have that same level of talent. But some of the stars in this league are really special.
How many bids do you think they will get? 3?
Yeah, I was going to get into this at the end, but I think it'll be 3, likely 3, potentially 4. And this kind of is the perfect transition into into talking about the Mountain West tournament, previewing that. It begins tomorrow, Wednesday, March 12th, with the 3 first round games. CSU does not play until Thursday. They get the winner of Nevada and Fresno State in the 7-10 game. San Jose State, Wyoming in the 8-9, and then you've got UNLV and Air Force in the 6-11. All those 3 games are on Wednesday. I think what I wanted to start with was, if you're looking at the NCAA tournament, I think there's going to be a 3-bid league, potentially 4, if somebody that I don't expect wins the tournament. And I think starting off, essentially, San Diego State and Boise State looks like a play-in game to me, because both are right on the bubble. I think San Diego State is last 4 in per ESPN, and Boise State is first 4 out. So I do think that's going to be. It looks like it's going to be maybe not a quad 1 win, depending on how it goes. Like both those teams are right on the late 40s, early 50s there. But I do think whoever wins that game is going to get sent to Dayton, probably, unless they end up winning it all. Where do you stand right now with how many bids you think the league's going to get, and kind of how do you think that could shake out over the weekend?
I do think if somebody unexpected, like outside of the top 5, wins a UNLV, a Nevada, somebody like that, it's probably at the cost of one of those other teams.
Probably, yeah.
I think back to 2015, CSU was a 27-win team. Wyoming ended up winning the Mountain West tournament as like a 6 or a 7 seed. See, it ended up costing CSU a bid in the end. So I do think that could be a factor. I don't anticipate that. I think the top teams are kind of in a class in their own. I think some of those other teams are capable of winning a game, but winning 3 or potentially 4 in a row for those Nevada or UNLV teams, I just don't see them pulling a New Mexico last year and being able to sustain that. San Diego State and Boise State have the non-conference resumes, so I struggle with seeing them get left out. I think San Diego State, just on brand recognition alone, is probably going to get the benefit of the doubt more so than Boise State. So maybe San Diego State could survive losing that game and still sneaking into Dayton or something like that. But I'm with you. I think it's probably a play-in game, and I think Utah State is fairly safe at the moment. But if they were to lose big, I don't think the eye test favors them at the moment. And there is a human element of this that you always have to consider. But yeah, I think it's a 3 league at the moment.
Yeah, and I think there's a chance, just like last year, where both CSU and Boise got sent to Dayton. I do think there's a chance that two teams get sent to Dayton again, especially if it's a 4-bid league. I think that's almost certainly going to be the case. All right, let's preview these games a little bit. Let's start with CSU. I think it's going to be Nevada, although Fresno State has been weirdly frisky at times this year, but I think it's going to be Nevada, and that's kind of a more difficult first game than maybe you would have liked as the 2 seed. Just with, we mentioned Nick Davidson, they've also got Kobe Sanders, they've got some high end talent, and we've seen them play some of the top teams tough. But CSU did sweep them during the regular season, winning in Reno and beating them pretty convincingly recently at Moby. Just kind of, what do you like about CSU's path as the 2 seed, and ultimately, where do you feel like they will get to at a minimum?
I mean, you can't overlook Nevada. Like, they've got talent. There's a reason they were picked top 5 in the preseason. They've underwhelmed, and I mean, a lot can happen. Maybe they just needed some time off, but I would say if you've watched them over the last couple of weeks, they don't exactly give the impression of a team that's chomping at the bit to like try and make a run here. They kind of look like a group that is making their, spring break plans at this point.
Yeah, there were the Steve Alford rumors about him maybe retiring too, although he's disputed that a little bit. So there's that could potentially come into play too.
He's like, shoot, man, I'm cashing checks. I'll make them fire me. I'm not going anywhere.
Respect that, CTC.
Hey, I respect it too. I think CSU is in a really good spot. I mean, the one thing that's always unfavorable about the Mountain West bracket, and it was the same case when they were in the 2 seed in 2017, is if you win the semifinal, that semifinal on Friday nights at 10 p.m. Mountain Time scheduled tip, and there have been plenty of times over the years where the games in front of it go long and it ends up being closer to like an 11 p.m. tip. If you win, you then turn around, you're playing at 4 p.m. in the afternoon the next day. It's just stupid. It's for TV. I get it, but it's really dumb, and it's a pretty big disadvantage if you're on that side of the bracket. The benefit, obviously, is not having to face New Mexico, who is definitely the toughest draw until at least the title game. And I think really everybody else in the league, CSU has proven they match up pretty well against, and even New Mexico, who beat them pretty convincingly in both games, like we've talked about already. I'd like to see the Rams get another crack at them. Like it's just hard to beat any team 3 times, and you could say the same thing with CSU and Nevada, and then potentially like who they draw after that, likely Utah State, but we'll see. It's just hard to beat the same team 3 times, and I know that's a bit of a cliche, but I really think it's true.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. I think they needed to get the 2 seed, and obviously before the Boise game, it was like, okay, they're either going to likely be the 2 or the 4 at this point, and they obviously beat Boise and get the 2 seed. I do like how they match up with Utah State, and I'll get into my picks here, and then I'll ask you for yours. I think San Jose State beats Wyoming to face New Mexico. I think Nevada win. I think all the top seeds win on day 1. So Nevada, San Jose State, and UNLV. And getting into the quarters, I think New Mexico cruises. I think Boise State does beat San Diego State. And then I think CSU beats Nevada and Utah State beats UNLV. And then getting in the semifinals, like I do think CSU does match up pretty well against Utah State. The game at the Spectrum a month ago, like I don't think you're expecting Utah State to make its first 7 threes again, ever. Like that was just a crazy game with them getting up 20 in like an instant. And CSU still hung around that game, and like it didn't end up being a blowout.
55 in the second half. Like
I know.
Last 3 halves of basketball against them, they're averaging like north of 50 points per half against them.
Yeah, and in the reverse game, CSU flips the switch, gets up big, and Utah State was just kind of done. They never really made I think they ran all off like a 7-2 run or something to start the second half. And it was like, okay, it's under 20 again, the lead. But then CSU just put the foot right back on the gas and cruised to, what felt like a 35-point win. I don't even remember what it ended up being.
I think it was
but they
27.
Were just,
yeah.
Yeah, that sounds about right. But they were 30 points better than Utah State that day. So I think they get past the Aggies too and get to the championship game. And I think they meet New Mexico. Like you said, we talked about this on your podcast too. Like, I want the Rams to get another crack at this New Mexico team because I don't think the gap is as wide as those first two games showed. I think CSU is a much different team than from when they played them at Moby in 2024, at the end of the calendar year. And I don't think Nick Clifford is going to have the same type of game he had in the pit. And I think CSU wins this thing. Like, I think they're playing as good as anybody in the conference right now. And even if they just get to the title game and don't get blown out by New Mexico, I think they're sneaking in as an at-large bid and going to Dayton for the second straight year. But screw Dayton, man. Like, I think they're getting the automatic qualifier spot, and they're going to get a 10 or an 11 seed, and they're going to go be a team no 5 or 6 seed or 7 seed wants to play in the first round of the NCAA tournament because – for all the reasons we've talked about, they've got a superstar in Nick Clifford who has an All-American case in his own. I think if there's two players in this conference that you could give All-American honors to, it's Nick and Donovan Dent. And they've got the depth and complementary pieces outside of a superstar to be a really, really dangerous team in March. And that's why I really do think this is the Rams' time that they finally get over the hump and take the crown in Vegas.
I like it, man. You got to clip that for social. You're gonna get Ram fans fired up. That was inspiring. No, I'm with you. I think this is the year, and it was a total shot in the dark. So this, like, it wasn't like I genuinely believed it. But one of my 10 bold preseason predictions was a team with a lot of new pieces would struggle out of the gate, would be very competitive by February or March. And that ultimately the Rams would get into the tournament by winning the Mountain West tournament for the first time since 2003. Didn't anticipate they'd have an at-large case based on the regular season. I also didn't think they'd win 16 league games. So, like, I'm not trying to say I saw this all coming. They struggled a lot more than I thought they would out of the gate too. But you just kind of figured, like we talked about earlier, that this would, with the experience they had, if the sophomores were able to make a leap, this team would be right there in the mix and they'd have a pretty good chance. And, as talented as some of those other teams were in previous years, it kind of felt like they were running on fumes by the time we got here.
Yeah, for sure.
It doesn't feel like that with this team.
No, not at all. Yeah, I just think that they're playing so. I mean, obviously the win streak helps, but I think we talked about this as well in your podcast. Like, I really kind of believe they were going to win that Boise State game. Like, and I think in years past,
you don't.
Yeah, you did, like in years past, maybe even some of the Roddy teams, like, you don't expect them to win a game like that late in the season with so much on the line. Not just keeping your at-large hopes alive, but also playing for the 2 seed, in the Mountain West tournament and playing for seeding. And in that game, they got down by 7, 8, 9 points, around 10 points, 3 or 4 times in that game, and every time they chipped away. And at the end, they had the best player on the floor in Nick Clifford, and he won the game. And I'm not expecting him to average 30 points per game in this Mountain West tournament. But I do think whoever gets the most out of their star, I've said this multiple times now on my pod, that whoever gets the most out of their star, whether it's New Mexico, CSU, Boise, or Utah State, the 4 teams I really think can win it. I think that team will win it, and I trust Nick Clifford with the way he's playing right now to be the best player in Las Vegas, and I think that's what's ultimately going to matter more than anything.
Anything can happen, obviously, in 40 minutes. I mean, we've seen plenty of fluky results in the conference tournament, but you have a pretty good sample size now of this team playing very high-level basketball. And if they do what they are capable of, if everybody plays the role that they are capable of playing, and that's what's exciting about this team is, like, it's not one of those years where you're hoping and praying for, a 50-point, explosion every night. Like, oh, we need something miraculous in order to pull this off. Like, this team is good enough. It's just, can they do what they're capable of doing? Hard to do it 3 straight days. That's obviously always a factor, but that's the case for everybody. Everybody's got the same conditions here. I'm excited. I feel like CSU is playing as well as they have going into the conference tournament as basically any year that I can remember.
All right, man. I appreciate you coming on, doing this little home and home here, previewing the Mountain West tournament. I will be watching from home all week in Vegas. I've got high school basketball duty here in Denver, so I'll be still be doing basketball stuff and a little bit of DU hockey stuff. But I'll be watching from afar. And but if the Rams do make it, I'll be traveling to cover wherever they go. So appreciate you coming on, Justin, and being one of my first repeat guests here.
Anytime, man. Love talking hoops with you. And it's fun to go to Magnus, man. The Pios they're wagging right now.
Oh yeah, for sure. Playoffs start this week, and I'll be there for that. All right, that'll do it from part 1 here. Next up, we have Troy Finnegan coming on to preview the Big 12 tournament. We got into similar format, our all conference picks, and then picking who's going to win the conference tournament. So stay tuned for that. And thanks to Justin for coming on for part 1, and thanks everybody for tuning in. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Basketball in the Mountains, our conference tournament preview episode. I covered the Mountain West preview, obviously, at the top, and now we are back to talk about the Big 12 tournament, which starts on Tuesday. Starts a day earlier than the Mountain West, but that's because they have an extra round, just more teams. Kind of how these things go. They'll both end on Saturday evening. And to do so, to preview the Big 12 tournament, talk a little bit about CU's win the other day against TCU, and just kind of recapping the Big 12 season as a whole. We've got Troy Finnegan on from CU Sports Report. Troy was on an earlier episode talking about CU specifically. I think that was episode 2 a couple weeks ago. But Troy, thanks for coming back on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really looking forward to it.
All right, yeah. So we're gonna talk Big 12 hoops, but first we'll talk about CU's win over TCU in the regular season finale. Troy, I remember when you were on a couple weeks ago after the UCF win for the Buffs, we said that they had probably one winnable game left on the schedule, and it was this TCU game. Now, they did end up beating Baylor at home as well, which was one of their probably their most impressive win of the season. But they dominated TCU on Saturday, a game I was at for senior day. I think they won by 20, the biggest win in Big 12 play, which not hard considering they only had 3, but a really interesting way for them to go out, winning 3 of 4 home games, 3 of their final 4 home games, despite how terrible the Big 12 season was for these guys. I mean, just kind of what was your big takeaway from the win, if you had any, for the Buffs?
Yeah, I think that the one thing that we had really talked about last time, even though they hadn't started winning games yet, was that they were finally kind of starting to play a little bit better. We know the limitations that this roster had, that this team had, and that led to them a lot of their losses in league play. But I think you kind of saw that roll over into the Baylor win, which you mentioned, and I really thought they played well against TCU. TCU is struggling, but I thought that I thought they guarded really well. And it was nice to see, some of the seniors have some really nice contributions. Julian Hammond obviously has been solid all year, but Javon Ruffin had some moments in this game. I think he hit his first 3 threes.
He only played 11 minutes because he hasn't fouled the whole game.
Yeah. Trevor Baskin had 16 boards. He was everywhere. So I thought that was really fun, just for them to put together probably their most complete effort for me. It wasn't perfect, but, even a lot of the games that they played well in, there was kind of these ebbs and flows and ups and downs. And I thought that this was probably their most well-rounded outing on both ends of the floor. And you see that in the final result.
Yeah, I wrote in my story in Denver Gazette after the game that if you take away the records, it was probably the perfect senior day performance that Tad Boyle could have asked for. Like, you mentioned Julian Hammond, Javon Ruffin. Those guys played well. Andre Akimovsky was pretty good on defense, like he has been all season. Elijah Malone seems like he has a chance to come back because he has that extra year of eligibility for playing in the NAIA for 4 years. So it seems like he has a chance to come back, but he's still technically as a senior. And he was pretty solid in that game, although you like to get there are ways if he does end up coming back, we'll talk about him and how ways he can get improved for next year. But you factor that all in with a walk on and Jack P's able to throw. He's the one dribbling the ball out as the clock expires. Just kind of a nice senior day win playing Tad Boyle basketball for the Buffs. But obviously it was only their third of Big 12 play. So, I mean, everybody that took the mic after the game said, not the season we wanted to have at all, but, glad they were able to get a win on Saturday afternoon. And obviously now they have some momentum going into the Big 12 tournament. If, we didn't think this was possible, but they're not the worst team momentum wise going into the Big 12 tournament, not the worst vibes team. And like you said, they have been playing well, and it's almost a little bit head scratching because they're not as bad as the record suggests. I think, I don't think they're as much worse than the other teams I think they're closer to TCU than TCU is to the top teams at in the conference, but the records wouldn't suggest that. I do think they have good pieces, and I do think they could have been a 6 or a 7 win team in Big 12 play, and I don't think they're as far behind as the other teams in the conference as the records would suggest. So we can transition to talk a little bit about just kind of bigger takeaways from the Big 12 season as a whole. Obviously, Houston is the outright winner. Obviously, fully deserving. They were awesome all season long. You and I have talked about how big of fans we've been of Kelvin Sampson's program for years now. So this is not overly surprising that they had the season that they did. They're going to be the number 1 seed in the tournament, the conference tournament. Obviously, they could be a number 1 seed in the NCAA tournament as well after going 19-1 in Big 12 play. But we'll do. Did anybody really surprise you maybe in the Big 12 that you weren't expecting, good or bad? And then after that, we can kind of get into who our awards would be for Big 12 play.
Yeah, I mean, this gets into the part of the awards, but I think that the biggest surprise for me was BYU, who I think is just playing some really awesome basketball. They'll be a trendy pick for a lot of people in 6 days' time to make a bit of a run. They're playing really well. I think that Texas Tech, was I expected them to be good, but for Texas Tech to be a legitimate top 10 team, maybe crawling onto that 2 line, that at possibly next Sunday, that is a bit of a surprise. And I think that they've been a lot of fun to watch. On the bad side, I think that, we both expected Kansas to be contending for the conference title with their
not roster. 8 games behind Houston, you mean?
No, we talked about Kansas a little bit last time, but they've been disappointing. Although I do think they're playing like marginally better. I'm not high on Kansas I'm not buying Kansas stock by any means, but I don't think it's as bad as it was a couple weeks ago. And then Baylor is the other one where I think I'm so upset that VJ Edgecombe was not on last year's Baylor team.
Yeah, that's true.
He's on this year's Baylor team because he
might have to go to Dayton in a week, which would be rough for them.
That would be fun though.
Yeah,
put VJ Edgecombe in Dayton. Put him there with Jeremiah Fears. We'll have a whole draft party.
There we go.
And then Kansas State has been kind of banged up, but with the amount that they invested in that roster and the talent that they have, and you saw it for the stretch in the middle of the season. They beat Iowa State, they beat Kansas,
they beat Arizona too. I think they won.
Yeah, you saw it. Yeah, they did beat Arizona. You saw it for a couple weeks, and then they kind of fell off. Coleman Hawkins got banged up at the end of the year, which was tough for them. But overall, for them to finish below 500, and I think they're the 10th seed in the conference tournament. They are for them.
Yeah, I think Texas Tech, has been a little bit more surprising than I expected. Like, I like a lot of their guys, which we'll talk about in the awards. I'll have at least one of their guys on my first team. all Big 12. I think Cincinnati would be the other team that was a little bit more disappointing because I do like Wes Miller as a coach. They were impressive when they came to Boulder and won a kind of a gritty game. I do like some of their guys, and just them going 7-13, like they're way better than UCF, and they finished with the same record in conference play. Like I just think they're way better than UCF and Oklahoma State, who also went 7-13. Like that was one that was really surprising. And honestly, even a little bit for Iowa State, like I thought they would be a lot closer to Houston than they were. They ended up being 6 games behind Houston. I felt like Houston and Iowa State were the 2 best teams going into the Big 12 play. And it just didn't really work out that way for Iowa State. They had some, like you mentioned, they had a head-scratching loss at home to Kansas State. They had some other weird losses throughout the year. They lost again at home recently to BYU, which ended up being a double overtime game. That was a great game. It's just a weird year for Iowa State, although I do think they can make a deep run in March, which I'll talk about on this podcast once the bracket comes out next week. Do plenty about the Mountain West and Big 12 teams who are actually dancing. So
I cut Iowa State a little bit of slack too. I do agree with you. The eye test really hasn't been there, but
the injuries,
Keyshawn Gilbert's been hurt for the last month. They played Houston without Gilbert and Curtis Jones, which was
that was a disaster.
Not who you want to play. They kept that game close too.
They did,
but not who you want to play without your 2 leading scorers. But I do agree with you on that. There'll be a brutal 4 seed for somebody.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it'll be a fun second round game if they, or a Sweet 16 game as well if they're able to get to the Sweet 16 and play one of the ones. That would be fun to see them play Auburn or Duke or Florida, somebody like that. So, all right, we'll quickly do some awards and then we'll talk about the tournament itself. We'll do Coach of the Year, Player of the Year, and then a 5-man first team. Who would you have for that? We'll start with Coach of the Year.
The 10-man first teams that they do in the official.
No, we are not doing the Pac-12 model of 10 guys on the first team. We're going to do we're going to put together a basketball team of the best players in the Big 12 this season. We'll start with Coach of the Year because I think there's no debate there. Would you agree with me that Kelvin Sampson should be the Coach of the Year in the Big 12?
I don't know about no debate, actually. I think there's some good candidates for this.
Kevin Young, I hear that, yeah.
I do think I would go with Kelvin Sampson, but I think this is a tight race. I think it's hard to turn down going 19-1 in probably the second best conference in the country. They were 10-0. They were 10-0 on the road in conference play, which is ridiculous.
That's what sold it for me, honestly.
Kansas should get credit for half of one of those wins for Houston. One of those, but that's hard to turn down. But Kevin Young made a really, really strong case for me.
They won their last 8 games, man.
They're playing so well, man. The demolition of Kansas that they had at home, going and beating Arizona, beating Iowa State, both on the road. Those are really, really impressive wins to have that team that at the beginning of conference play really was kind of struggling and was kind of going through it. They were a bubble team. To in his first year to get that train on the tracks mid-season and get them playing the way they are, I do think deserves mention. And I do think he gave Kelvin Sampson a run for his money, but I do agree with you that Kelvin Sampson is my Coach of the Year.
Yeah, we talked about BYU on a previous episode I did with my guy Sean Walker from KSL. We talked about Utah's coaching search, which has now been resolved. They are going to hire Alex Jensen, who was one of the 2 guys we mentioned on that on that episode before talking about. This was before BYU even went to Iowa State and won that game. They were in the midst of they won 6 in a row at that point, but they climbed all the way to 14-6 despite a tough start to Big 12 play. And that probably leads into the Player of the Year debate, I think. My pick is going to be JT Toppin from Texas Tech, but I do think Richie Saunders deserves a shout out because it is weird that I will have someone from Houston on my all Big 12 team, but I do not think anybody on Houston deserves or should be in the discussion for Player of the Year. There's a couple guys you could go with, but I'm going to go with JT Toppin, I think, for Player of the Year. Do you agree, or do you have somebody different?
I have JT Toppin as well. I just, some of the games that he had for a Texas Tech team that also really struggled with injuries and won a lot of the
Yes.
games that they played without Chance McMillan. Darian Williams was banged up. Some of the games that JT Toppin had just dominating on the interior. The Arizona State game that went the double overtime, or was it?
Yeah, I think it was. I think it was double overtime. Yeah.
Yeah, that he had a couple of huge games. That one really sticks out. So I did go with JT Toppin.
Yeah, like I said, Richie Saunders, I felt like deserves some consideration just for how good BYU was in the second half of the season. He was very clearly their best player all season long. We have talked many times about how I am not a Caleb Love guy, so I will not I will not endorse that. And I just don't think Kansas is good enough for Hunter Dickinson to really get real consideration, despite his numbers. And the other guy I maybe would have considered was Curtis Jones if Iowa State finished a little bit higher. But I think JT Toppin is the right pick, and that kind of leads right into the All Big 12 team. So we'll do 5 guys. We don't have to worry about positions, just your top 5 guys. Obviously, JT Toppin will be on there for me, and then I'm going to go Richie Saunders from BYU. I will go LJ Cryer from Houston, and then I'm going to go Curtis Jones from Iowa State, and I will wrap it up with Hunter Dickinson as my 5th guy. Who do you got on your 5, Troy?
So we're similar. I went with JT Toppin, obviously my player of the year. Richie Saunders is on mine. Hunter Dickinson is on mine as well, and I say this as not a Hunter Dickinson guy. I don't think Hunter Dickinson really got enough love for how well he's played this year because of Kansas as a whole has been disappointing. Hunter Dickinson, for the most part, has not been very disappointing. It's been mostly the guys around him. So I do think he made the team pretty easily for me. I had Toppin. I had LJ Cryer as well, was my 4th.
Yes.
I thought that he played really well, kind of stepping into a bigger role offensively without Jamal Shed. The LJ Cryer revenge game at Baylor was great too.
That was good.
That was a great touch. And then I went with VJ Edgecombe. I wanted to go with Curtis Jones. I think that VJ was just awesome for Baylor.
Yeah.
That guy freaking everywhere.
When we get closer to draft time and we get to do our big boards, we will both have VJ Edgecombe very high.
Very, very high. Saturday night, that dude was all over the place, man. He made 4 or 5 plays in that game where I was like,
the chase down block and transition was ridiculous that he made.
The chase down block and the dunk where he jumped from outside the paint on like the 3rd hash and easily dunked it. It was so I think that he carried a pretty big load for Baylor offensively at times. Jeremy Roach was kind of disappointing sometimes. Rob Wright was up and down. So I went with VJ Edgecombe over Curtis Jones by just a hair. For my All Big 12.
VJ was also in consideration for me. Caleb Love sadly was in consideration for me. And then the other guy I did consider was Javon Small from West Virginia because he was their entire team. If you watch them, so they finished 10-10, which maybe is slightly disappointing for them. But he was the leading scorer in the conference, and anytime you turned on a West Virginia game, they were like, Javon Small, please save us at the end of a shot clock. That was kind of their offense.
Their offense was ugly. And then I feel for them because they lost Tucker DeVries.
Yes. Not having Tucker DeVries all season really is tough for them.
Their offense is nasty, though.
Yeah, and it was a lot of Javon Small, please save us. And he did do that at times, and it was good enough for them to finish top half. So I figured he deserved some love there. So just to recap, Troy and I both have Kelvin Sampson and JT Toppin as coach and player of the year. And then my all Big 12 team was LJ Cryer, JT Toppin, Richie Saunders, Curtis Jones, and Hunter Dickinson. And Troy had the exact same, except he had VJ Edgecombe instead of Curtis Jones in his all Big 12. So we will move on to talking about the Big 12 tournament itself, which begins on Tuesday with the first round games, the unlucky 8 teams that have to play on the first round on Tuesday. Oklahoma State and Cincinnati kicks things off, and then CU plays TCU in the second game. Then we have Kansas State, Arizona State, and then Utah, UCF. I don't think either of us are going to have any of these teams winning more than one game, maybe two in this. But do any of the teams here stick out for you, Troy? And then we'll talk a little bit about CU specifically as well and their matchup against TCU.
Yeah, I think Kansas State is the interesting one, right?
Yeah, for
we
sure.
Talked about kind of the talent on that squad. Cincinnati as well is a talented team, but Iowa State as the second round draw is not great.
Yeah.
Whereas Kansas State, if they get by Arizona State, which I expect them to do, they'll get to play Baylor, who is pretty beatable right now. I don't think Baylor's playing very well at all. I would really recommend that Baylor wins that game if they don't want to be playing on a Tuesday or Wednesday next week. But Kansas State, I think that if they can kind of find that mojo that they had during that win streak, you get a game against Arizona State. I think we see it every year that, these teams that are talented teams that have to play the first day or the day before, it does help to get to play a game at the neutral site, play on the rims. That play
on the ugly court that the Big 12 has put together for this tournament, the gray court.
I mean, watching that court for the women's tournament last week was an eyesore. The women's Big 12 tournament was great, but what happened to regular colored basketball courts? Nobody complained about that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think Kansas State, I mean, obviously if they get to a quarterfinal against Texas Tech, my expectations would be pretty low for that. But I think that they're the most interesting team out of these 8.
Yeah, I wrote about some potential bid stealers in my College Basketball Insider that ran in Saturday's Denver Gazette. And I did list Kansas State just because of exactly what you mentioned. The win streak they had earlier this season, like they've shown that they can put it together for a couple of games. Now, asking anyone to win 5 basketball games in 5 days is a tall task, and I don't expect that like you, but I could see them getting to the quarterfinals as well. So just quickly on TCU versus CU, what are your expectations for CU in this game? And I mean, it's kind of a nice matchup, I feel like, for the Buffs, just considering they didn't get blown out by TCU in the first game in Fort Worth, obviously won on Saturday. These two teams are very familiar with each other. Feels like the Horned Frogs are a little bit checked out as a non-tournament team, despite them being the 9 seed in the Big 12. They don't really have a path to the tournament unless they win a couple games here. But they would probably have to beat Houston even in the quarterfinals to even get back on the bubble. But do you think CU could win this game, and how do you feel like it could play out?
Yeah, I expect a pretty tight game, actually, not one that is befitting of a 9 versus 16. You mentioned it, TCU's bubble has pretty much popped with this slump that they've been on lately. And CU, like, there's no better team to come in and play against to bring confidence and momentum into a game than a team that you just beat by 20 points on your home floor. Obviously, it'll be a little bit of a different dynamic, neutral court. CU, I think, played with a lot of emotion on senior day, which obviously you lose that. But I do think that CU is playing well enough, and they've rolled it over into a couple of games now to the point where I do think that CU has a pretty good chance of winning this one. And, you win one game and you see what happens.
Yeah, they would play West Virginia in the second round, which is a team that they only saw once during the regular season, and that was back in early January when they lost at home. A game they probably should have won, looking back on it, that they kind of threw away at the end.
A few of those.
But I think beyond that for CU, I think just winning one game would be a huge success, I think, for this team with how the Big 12 season has gone. I do think it's a good matchup. Like I said, TCU is not a good offensive team at all. They've had injuries as well. Frankie Collins has been out for almost all season. He was their big money NIL transfer portal addition, and he just really has not. He just hasn't been available for a long time for that team. Who obviously had a different season if he's healthier. But CU, I do think they actually will win that game tomorrow afternoon, and then we'll see about. Yeah, let's see about West Virginia in the second round. That's going to be a toss-up as well. We talked about how West Virginia's offense is not great either outside of Javon Small. And then if they do end up winning that game as well, they would have to play Houston, which we know how that game will go. But, yeah, because the double buys, as I didn't mention yet, but Houston's the number 1 seed. Texas Tech is number 2 seed. Arizona at the 3 seed, and BYU is the 4 seed. So those are the double buys there. And then because obviously we talk about teams in the Mountain Time Zone, what do you think about Utah UCF tomorrow as well? Utah has played a little bit better as of late, despite the coaching change. But it feels like, if they win, they'll get Kansas in the second round. That would be an interesting matchup as well, with Lawson Elvering against Hunter Dickinson. The battle of the big guys there.
The two most loved players in Boulder, Colorado, Lawson Levering and Hunter Dickinson.
Yeah, that's for sure.
The two fan favorites at CU. I do think that Utah has been playing some competitive ball, at least, even after firing Craig Smith, which the timing of that was a little odd to me.
Yeah.
But,
they really did not want to give him a chance to save his job. That's for sure.
That was an interesting one. And Utah beat Kansas, so I do think that I would expect Utah to come through that game. Gabe Matson's playing some good basketball, and then it's an interesting game against Kansas. Obviously, it will be much more difficult to beat them on a neutral court than it was in Salt Lake.
There will be a lot of Kansas fans in Kansas City as well.
Yeah, there will be plenty of them. So that'll be an interesting game. But I do think that I like Utah in the first round against a UCF team that, kind of like you mentioned with TCU, feels kind of checked out at this point. Yeah,
and then we'll talk about BYU a little bit, because obviously they won't know who their game is yet, but their opponent is until Wednesday. They'll get either Iowa State or somehow Oklahoma State or Cincinnati. I think it'll be Iowa State. But that's a fascinating game, just considering BYU just beat them in Ames recently, and both those teams are obviously locked into the NCAA tournament at this point. But it feels like BYU continues to keep climbing up the seed list, and it seems like they're at least like a 5 or a 6. Right now, and Iowa State is similar, 4 or 5. I feel like, so that will be a fascinating quarterfinal game if it comes. I guess this will transition to the last thing I wanted to talk about with the Big 12 tournament, is like our actual picks, and then not an underdog, but a dark horse maybe you're looking at, or just like an alternate pick, because I think Houston is the obvious one, but I do think we might get a different winner than Houston, just with how these conference tournaments have gone. And how do you feel like it shakes out? Do you feel like anyone outside, just with the way these conference tournaments are set up, the winner almost always comes from the double bye, just with the advantage you have in the rest. You mentioned earlier about how playing a day earlier kind of gives you an advantage, but once teams have played, it's kind of all bets are off, and then rest is really a factor, and the amount of games you've played plays a difference. So the winner almost always comes from the double buys. But do you feel like there's anybody outside of there that could make a run? We mentioned Kansas State earlier. That was more of like a run to the quarterfinals. Do you think anybody outside of the top 4 can win this thing?
Yeah, I think Iowa State as a 5 is probably underseeded, considering I think how good we both think that Iowa State is. And that's a game, you mentioned fascinating quarterfinal between Iowa State and BYU. That's a game where, you start the first 10 minutes, BYU hasn't played, and Iowa State played on the court the day before. If Iowa State's up 10, 15 points, they can lock in, they can play defense. Keyshawn Gilbert, it sounds like, I think he's day-to-day right now. Yeah. So you would hope that by Friday or by Thursday for a quarterfinal that he would be ready to go. So that's a team. I still can't quit Baylor, even as many times as I watched them play poorly. I did think that they played well for a lot of Saturday night's game against Houston. I thought that they played pretty well. I thought they guarded really well. But they just can't quite put it all together. But that's a team that if they get hot, is another team that's really talented. A lot of good guard play. So I like them. But you mentioned, I think the coolest thing to watch with these quarterfinals, you mentioned these teams that are battling for tournament seeding, and these seed lines are so tight right now.
Yeah, they really are.
It's the cool part of the, you have a bad bubble, but that you get a bad bubble from all of the teams in the top 25 or 30, they're not giving these bubble teams good wins very often. And that makes it super competitive. Iowa State could be a 3, a 4, BYU, these lines between like 5, 6, 7, even all of those teams are jumbled together. So these are big games for these teams like Iowa State, BYU, and that'll be really fun to watch.
All right, let's wrap up by giving our picks for the winner. So I'll start with the quarterfinals. I'm going to go. I think Iowa State will beat BYU in the quarterfinal game. I think Houston will advance, and I think Texas Tech will advance as well against Baylor. And then I will have Kansas actually beating Arizona in the quarterfinals. I think the home court advantage they'll have there. I mean, U of A fans travel well too. Those are probably the two basketball fan bases in the conference with Kansas and Arizona. But I'll pick Kansas with the home cooking, and then I'll take Houston over Iowa State in the first semifinal, and I'll take Texas Tech over Kansas in the second semifinal, and I'll take Texas Tech to beat Houston in the Big 12 championship game, and Texas Tech getting up to the 2 seed line for the NCAA tournament. Texas Tech obviously is the only team that beat Houston in the regular season, so Houston will be hungry to get some revenge there. That's the only team that Houston could have that mindset going into face. But I do like the matchup for Texas Tech. We talked about why JT Toppin is really good when we picked him as player of the year. You mentioned Chance McMillian, Darian Williams as well. Those two guys are really good. And I think they've done. Grant McCaslin has done a great job there this season, and I have to, every time I watch them play, I'm just super impressed. And I do think they don't want to go chalk here, and I'll pick them to upset Houston in the championship game.
Our picks are similar. I also have Iowa State beating BYU in the quarterfinal, Houston beating West Virginia, Texas Tech beating Baylor, and I also have Kansas beating Arizona. I have Houston over Iowa State in the semis as well, although I do think that Iowa State – I would like to see that matchup with Iowa State healthier than they were last time. That would be really interesting to me to see all of those guards try and deal with the ball pressure of Houston and the size, the ability to protect the paint, the size on the interior with Joe Tugler, with Juwan Roberts. I agree with you. So this is kind of a weird triangle because I agree with you that I like the Texas Tech matchup against Houston, but I did pick Kansas to beat Texas Tech.
Okay.
Get to the final. I just think that Bill Self usually gets his guys playing pretty well. I mean, Bill Self has broken plenty of trends with this Kansas team based on previous ones, but I do think that he usually has Kansas playing pretty well in the Big 12 tournament. They'll have the home court, like you mentioned. I think that Kansas will have some revenge on their mind from that tough loss at home a couple weekends ago. That was a brutal one for them. And then in the championship game, I do have Houston beating Kansas. I just don't think that Kansas. It's really, really, really hard to play against Houston when you have the spacing limitations.
So when you can't make threes, that's tough. Yeah.
You put it a little more harshly than I did, but with DeJuan Harris and KJ Adams on the court, and we know Hunter Dickinson likes to live inside for the most part, especially if Zeke Mayo's been pretty up and down. AJ Storr has given them
not a lot.
Basically, not as much as he's getting paid to give them. That is for sure. So I went with Houston over Kansas in the championship game. Houston does. I think we talked about this last time. Houston does in a single elimination. I have a small worry where if Houston gets the wrong set of officials that are calling it really tight, it's going to be a long day. That happened to them last year in the NCAA tournament. A couple times actually, but I do think that with these matchups, I think they get by Iowa State, and I do like the Kansas matchup for them, so I went with Houston.
Yeah, I would like to see BYU versus Houston in a semifinal game. I just don't think we're going to get it. I think Iowa State's going to be jacked up, and like you mentioned, having the extra day, like like they could get out to a pretty big lead in the first half, which would be the opposite of what happened in Ames with BYU jumping out to a big lead and then Iowa State coming back and
after not scoring for like the first 6 minutes of the game, and then they scored 20 points. Like,
yeah. Well, that'll do it from today's episode. I previewed the Mountain West tournament by myself in the at the top of the show. So thanks for coming on, Troy, to preview the Big 12 tournament. And enjoy this week of basketball. I always say that when I was in college, at least at Penn State, and covering the Big 10 tournament, conference tournaments were my favorite thing to cover, just with all the teams playing and the back-to-back days. The NCAA tournament is really special, and I got to cover that last year. I'll be covering it again this year somewhere. Not exactly sure where yet. Could be in Denver, could be following somebody. We'll see. But yeah, the conference tournament is just a really, really fun and unique environment with just the 5 straight games of days, and especially in a conference as good as the Big 12. It's been really fun.
A lot of fun basketball ahead. Thanks, Tyler. Always a pleasure.
Yep, man. Thanks for coming on, Troy.
Yep.
All right, that'll do it from today's episode of Basketball in the Mountains. It's episode 8. Make sure to go rate, review, subscribe, wherever you get your podcast, Spotify, Apple, or if you prefer to watch on YouTube, subscribe there. Like the video, leave a comment. Really appreciate everyone tuning in. And, enjoy the week of basketball.